Serious, late night hikers, what is the creepiest thing you have seen while hiking? Not hiking so much as car camping, but we were way the fuck out there in the middle of nowhere on BLM land in Colorado. We drove for an hour and a half down a Forest Service road and didn't see another soul. However, you could see headlights and hear cars from miles away from our campsite. It's not like somebody could have snuck up unnoticed. We had 3 cars with 8 people in us. Just got done eating dinner, cleaned up. It was getting dark, so we went back to the cars real quick before hitting our tents for the night. Somebody had slashed the front right tire on each of the 3 cars with what appeared to be a box cutter. Everyone thought it was a prank, but it became very apparent, very quickly, that it wasn't. All of us were beyond spooked, like panicking, scary to watch spooked. We all had spares, and one dude had a gun, so we threw on our donuts while that guy guarded us and got the hell out of there. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. Just knowing there was some person, probably watching us, maybe wanting to harm us, makes me feel physically ill to this day. To answer some questions. This was south of Gypsum. And it was 100% not private land. This was a marked Forest Service road in an area with dispersed camping I had visited several times before. There were 3 guys and 5 girls. The guys were all together cooking the whole time leading up to us discovering the tires being slashed. These people are my best friends, and this would be wildly uncharacteristic of any of them. For those wondering how we didn't hear it, our cars were parked almost 30 yards away from our fire or tents. And a car coming down a road is easy to pick out from the sounds of nature. A gentle hissing gets lost in the wind. We heard it as soon as we started walking up. The tires were slashed on the exact same spot on the sidewall. It would be almost impossible for something on the road to puncture the tires like that. Also, there was no cell service. We called the cops and ranger as soon as we got back to the highway, told them exactly what FS road we were on, and gave them coordinates, but there isn't a lot for them to do. The cop told us it was good we were packing and to be careful out there. I go out for walks very late at night fairly often, so I've seen a few things. The creepiest, though, happened about 2 months ago. I left the house around 1:30 a.m. and it started as a normal walk. I wandered around the town till about 2 a.m. when I decided to go home. I was walking back to the route I had come from when I noticed a black van meander down the street. Didn't pay too much attention to it, though, at first. I did pay attention, though, when I saw it slowly drive by me for a second time. I wasn't entirely sure it was the same van, though, so I just continued walking. But this time, I kept an eye out. And lo and behold, about 10 minutes later, the same damn black van came down the street again. This time I knew for sure because it didn't have license plates. Now I was fairly scared, so I picked my pace up a little bit. When the van came around again, this time, it stopped in the middle of the road a few houses in front of me. I stopped, turned around, and booked it back in the other direction. I made a few turns onto different roads and then ran right into someone's yard. I waited behind their fence, and the same fucking van came down the street. I assumed that when they couldn't find me, they finally decided to fuck off. But I waited in that yard for about 20 minutes before I ran back to my house and practically threw myself through my bedroom window. Not so much hiking as walking home after work one night a lot of years ago. I normally got off around 7 p.m., and my walks home were uneventful. However, this night I covered a half shift for someone and worked until 11 p.m. There was a trail behind some train tracks I would take home to avoid walking beside traffic and whatnot. I realized that night those trails were a lot different at 11 p.m. than at 7 p.m. I happened across a guy who was lying by his bike moaning in pain. It didn't sound like real moaning, more like a kid's fake "I have a tummy ache and can't go to school" moan. I also noticed his bike was standing up on its kickstand. It didn't make sense that he would set his bike up properly only to fall to the ground in pain. He saw me and called out for help, but I kept walking and turned to make my way back up towards the street. As I turn, I suddenly hear some shuffling around, and the previously hurt gentleman yells at me, "I'm gonna kill you." He hops on his bike and starts rushing towards me. At this point, I'm most of the way up the incline going towards the railroad tracks that ran parallel to the street. I haul ass up there, and as I get over the tracks, my would-be assailant proceeds to hit the tracks with his front tire and flips over his handlebars, hitting the ground hard. He is now moaning in pain for real and makes genuine calls for help. I used a payphone at a gas station to call the cops and explain what happened. They get there, and the officer explains to me this guy's a village idiot who does this shit to rob people, and it's not the first time they had to pick his ass up after he biffed on a bike trying to rob someone. I told the officer he threatened to kill me, and he laughed. The dude wasn't even armed and has had his ass kicked more times than he can count using that little line of his. Not on a trail, but walking my dog late at night. My dog rang her bell at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I begrudgingly got up to take her outside. When she wants to pee in the middle of the night, I don't take her very far, just in our side yard. I took a flashlight with me in case she decided to poo so I could pick it up. I'm standing there waiting for her to do her thing. She is doing the doggy walk-in circle thing. Then all of a sudden, the dog gets spooked and whips around. Out of the corner of my eye, I see this chick just standing there. I didn't see her walk up. I didn't hear her walk up. I see her standing there super still. She had to have come from between my house and my neighbor's house based on her position, which is odd, because behind our houses back up to a green belt. It is probably 40 degrees outside, and this lady, about 20, is in super short shorts and a t-shirt. I looked at her, told her she scared me, and she mumbled something like, "Nice night, what are you up to?" Standing there holding the leash with my dog, I said, "I'm walking my dog." Then she said, "Cool, cool. Do you know how to get into my house?" I locked myself out. Pointing to my neighbor's house. Now, I'm a good American, I know my neighbors, and this wasn't my neighbor, a single 30-year-old female. She hangs out with my wife, so I know her well. So, I asked her, "That house?" Pointing directly at my neighbor's house. She nodded. I said, "You don't live there." "I know who lives there." She just scoffed and wandered her way into my backyard. I followed her, said, "What the hell are you doing?" She then took off running, scaled my fence. Which item of note, it isn't an easy fence to scale. It is a deer fence. It is a see-through fence that goes up 3 feet with a cattle gate, then the top of the fence is stainless steel wire that runs horizontally. It is the type of thing that you'd easily trip over if you weren't expecting it, as it is extremely hard to see and not very common. Anyways, she scaled the fence and ran away into the green belt. I always have a pocket knife on me and was fortunate enough to have my, unfortunately useless dog. So, I looked around my house, neighbor's house for other people. Shined my light in the green belt. And nothing. I have no idea how she wound up back there, what she was doing, what she intended to do. But she scared the ever-living shit out of me. As an astute Redditor pointed out, mongooses and rattlesnakes don't coexist in any region in the world. It is Texas, and I've seen crazy stuff back there. Possums, roadrunners, owls, coyotes, bobcats, deer, regularly, lots of snakes, skunks, etc. I am not an expert on local fauna, so I guess Rikki Tikki Tavi doesn't live back there. I just know there are tons of thorns and assorted shrubbery that make it an awful place to chill. Common questions. Was she hot? In a different context, maybe. As a creeper chick leaping deer fences like Jason Bourne, no. Was it a meth head? This is my best guess. It was late, and she had the leaping abilities of a kangaroo. Picture of the fence, it is kind of hard to explain. But if you see those wires that go all the way across, it is made to keep deer from jumping. But it also makes it a super easy thing to trip on, especially in the dead of night. It was in the summer around dusk, and I was camping at a remote campground with my dad. There was a lake right next to the grounds, and my dad and I would trailblaze through the forest right next to the lake because if you went far enough, there was a really pretty waterfall. A few strange things happened on this hike. First, we found a slash pile that had a little kid's shoe on top. Then, when we came to a small clearing, my dad had to take a leak. He faced one side of the clearing, and I faced the other, and we both heard a child say, "I'm over here." My dad thought it was me, and when he realized it wasn't, we spent half an hour looking for someone, but we found nobody. After that, we gave up going to the waterfall and started to make our way back to camp, but there were clear sounds of something following us, twigs snapping, bushes shaking. We haven't been camping there since. I was walking around my neighborhood alone once, enjoying the night air and watching the stars. This little pond near my house, with a wooded area that had trees, a bench, and a rope swing that went out over the water. I sat down on the bench to look at the stars, and I heard some rustling off to my right, towards the trees. Bears were not uncommon where I'm from, so I took out my flashlight and shone it around over there. I didn't see anything. It freaked me out, so I kept my flashlight on and my senses aware, but I stayed on the bench to mull over my thoughts and watch the sky some more. I don't know why I did that because that's typical horror movie shit. Anyway, a few minutes pass, and I hear nothing more, so I lean back into the bench and start to relax a bit. I'm staring up at the sky with my flashlight pointed downward so as not to create any light pollution when I notice something in the tree in my peripheral vision. I couldn't tell what it was, but the branch was swaying slightly, and the rustling noise was back too. I immediately sat up and stared at it but hadn't shown my flashlight at it yet in case of pissing off some huge bird or something else. I don't think I've ever been that scared. I remember my heart was beating so fast, and I could taste blood. I stared at it for what seemed like forever, and it slowly stopped moving. But the shape was still there. Bears do climb trees sometimes, so I was hesitant to run away if that's what it was. So, I just kept staring at it. After a while, I mustered up the little raisin-esque cojones to shine my goddamned light at the tree. It was a man. A man, in the tree, crouched in the tree like some silent monkey. He had no expression on his face, but his eyes were open wide. When my light landed on him, he started to move like he would come down, but I didn't stick around to see if he did. Instead, I jumped the bench and ran for the hills. I ran to my house and around to the back door and locked myself in without looking back once. I went around and made sure every window and door was locked. I even checked the attic. I never go out alone anymore. I did call the cops, but they didn't find him, and nothing came from it. I was paranoid for months after that, and started carrying pocket knives and pepper spray whenever I went out at night, even if I wasn't alone. I've concluded that this was, in fact, a crackhead, and I happened to just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Still don't recommend going out alone or unarmed at night, though. Be safe, please. I had a similar thing happen to me and my friends. It's a little different, but it was just around sunset, and a group of 4 of us went up to a sesh spot on the outskirts of a forest surrounded by massive trees, massive in the sense that you can see only 1/3 of the way if you're standing at the base looking up. Anyways, we were finishing up the sesh, and we hear a rustling in the trees above. My first thoughts were that it was just a squirrel or a larger animal moving around. I didn't think much of it. After a few minutes, the rustling is getting louder and louder. One of my friends shouts, "Look up!" And we see this man-sized figure moving towards us. At this point, we are all hightailing it out of there, tripping over roots and rocks while doing so. One of my friends was packing up his stuff and didn't get the chance to run, so it didn't take long for him to call out for us to come back. We walked back hesitantly to see this almost naked man with a huge beard climbing down the trunk of this tree, think Tom Hanks from Castaway. He then goes on to start lecturing us how we have to keep his home clean and that others come through and leave large messes for him to clean up and how disrespectful it was. After a 10-minute rant, he turns around and just walks deep into the forest, out of sight. The man was definitely on some next-level drugs, and it looked like he's been on them for quite some time. This spooked us a bit, so we stopped going there, but needless to say, we never littered at any sesh spots in the future. When my now wife and I first started dating, we would take long walks through our very small town after I got off work at 11 p.m. We would wander through the cemetery, down little country roads, everywhere. But our favorite area was a large field where the stars were incredible. One night we watched a small meteor shower and heard all kinds of loud grunting and commotion coming from a tree line. We had nowhere to go, and we were starting to get concerned. A large, angry buck came out, stared at us, and then quietly walked away. I don't think we breathed for several minutes. I was convinced he was coming at us, and there was no way to outrun him. We didn't go back there for a few days. I lived in the very far northwest of Washington state for a summer job in like '05, one of those national park circuit type jobs. You know, people work each season moving from park to park as the next season begins, and they hire us filthy traveling hippies to do the work management won't do, like maintenance and waiting on people in the resort's restaurant, etc. So, there's like 23 people who've never met, people who all just flew to the middle of nowhere into a rainforest valley together to work for a couple months, and what do some good-natured hippies do on the first night? We get beer and get stoned and go hiking together. The first night we come across a dead body on the side of a trail and have to call the majors, actual forest police, and the night is blown. There's only one little check stand for miles and miles, and really all they do is radio into the resort if there's a bear or cougar sighting, and tell us which direction it's heading, or, in this case, deal with an unexplained corpse. Day 2, a new arrival, who had worked there the previous summer, has a very cool hidden beach to hike to and have a campfire. We finally have our party, well into the night, and after we clean up and extinguish our fire, we take the headlamps and begin our trek back to the dorms. A few minutes in, the lead hiker stops dead in his tracks. We hear a kind of low growl, and as I sling my guitar case behind me and step around a few people to see what this is all about, a gigantic fucking cougar is staring at us, eyes glowing in the headlamps, directly on our trail, or more appropriately, his trail. The place only opened for season a day or two before, so for months at a time, no humans stomped around these parts at all, save for the aforementioned unfortunate soul. Well, everyone started yelling, and we all shook our keys and banged on everything we could, and luckily, the giant leapt away without incident, but it was a hell of a couple days. When I was very little, like 5 or 6, my dad used to take me on all sorts of adventures through nature, especially when we owned a little cottage up in the Scottish Highlands. Now, my dad is sort of a combo Irish bloke plus Yorkshire laddie type of fellow and very spry, despite his being about 55 at the time, and on this particular occasion had decided we were going to go hiking way up into the cliffs. I was quite happy with this development as it meant a piggyback ride for at least 90% of the difficult bits. This was a proper trek. He wanted to get to one of the highest bluffs so we could have an amazing 360-degree view of the gorgeous meadows and some sparkling sea, but after we reached the top plains, where it's all short, wind-whipped grass and you can see for miles, he suddenly turned very still and very quiet. When you're small, your parents are God, so seeing your dad look frightened is scarier than anything your own mind can come up with. So I was pulling on his arm and going, What? My mom is epileptic. I saw her fits when I was a kid, so I thought it was happening to him too, or something similar, and I wouldn't know what to do because we're up on this huge cliff. No one was around, when just as fast as he started it, he snapped out of it. Fireman lifted me right up and just started striding away without a word. Over his shoulder, I could see a big, pale yellow object stuck into the ground like an obelisk. I know now that it was a refrigerator. When I was older, I asked my dad about it. He stiffened up and told me that when he was a boy in the 50s, he and his little friends had found an old-style fridge in the woods, and being little boys, they opened it. Well, of course, they had found a body, another child, who by whichever means had found themselves in the fridge and unable to get out. My dad has never mentioned a gender, which makes me believe he witnessed a very decomposed or skeletonized individual, but I can't ask him. Remember that episode of The Simpsons where they unlock Homer's PTSD, and it turns out he found a dead body when he was a teenager? My dad grew increasingly uncomfortable the first time we saw that episode and had excused himself to the kitchen before the ending. My dad has seen some gnarly shit, but for whatever reason, he will not discuss anything further about this dead child in the fridge, only that it happened. So when he explained, I assumed it was the trauma, and I said something like, "Oh Dad, that's awful, so when you saw the fridge up there, it brings up the old memories?" And he honestly looked at me with his big blue eyes like I was an idiot. I'll never forget it. "No, Amy," he said in a very low tone, "it was because it was the same fridge. I was a little girl, so there was no chance my dad was going to open the fridge while I was right there and also possibly relive the experience of seeing what a mummified corpse inside a fridge looks like. No, I don't believe it was the same fridge, it literally would have had to traverse an ocean, but I believe my dad believes that it was. Most likely, it was a very similar make or model, and the sight of it just surprised him and sent him west. Someone pointed out it should have been reported just in case. I have absolutely no doubt that he did, but he's in his 70s now, so I don't intend to ask. I guess if you're ever up in the cliffs of the Isle of Skye, just keep your eyes peeled for a big beige fridge. I go hiking in the woods that permeate my town, sometimes so late that I get to see the sunrise out there. The strangest thing I ever saw was what I could only describe as a shanty town was built up seemingly overnight deep into the woods. Simple little hovels made of scrap metal and bed sheets and a small fire pit that someone had made out of an old tire, with the fire still burning. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that this was well past midnight when I found this place, and it was quiet as a grave. There was no one there. Someone made the trouble of getting a fire going and then left it. From the look of it, this place could hold about a dozen or so people, and yet there was nothing there but the fire they abandoned and whatever possessions they had left in the huts. Usually, it's what I hear. Large, fallen, branches snapping just out of sight of my headlamp. Or waking up an hour later and hearing steps and leaves rustling, but too exhausted and fearful of inspecting or wanting to know, probably nothing important anyway. One time I returned to my car after a late night hike with friends, and my SUV was covered in hand or paw prints. They were just so large and even dragged a little in the dust. It was near a large military base in the mountains. I think some local enlisted may have made them to scare us. But it was just so well done. It's pretty scary for all of us because it's what you'd imagine the Blair Witch would do. No animal did it. I often spent my summers bouldering with my friends by a relatively large forest that was about an hour and a half away from where I used to live. We used to spend some of the nights camping out there to save some travel costs and time. Anyway, I think this was roughly the third or fourth time we were out there camping. My friend had left all her climbing gear and her rucksack just outside her tent, or we think she did anyway. The next morning, we found her boots, a few clothes, and all her chalk powder had disappeared. We figured that it could have been completely feasible that she misplaced it. Although we were quite sure they were next to her tent, we didn't want to believe they were stolen. Anyway, We didn't read too much into this and just stupidly said to ourselves that perhaps she had left it by the boulders and some animal took an interest to it. It was very reasonable to us at the time. Anyway, fast forward a year, we're at the same spot, as usual, sitting by the tents and chilling after having some food. Mind you, it's pitch black out, and the fire lights only the camp area. So, I go somewhere a bit out of sight for a slash, and what do I see? A dude in a full-on ghillie suit laying on his stomach, looking right towards our campsite. I kind of stood there frozen as this dude clocks that I've seen him, and he bolts it out of there. I don't know whether the event prior was related to the ghillie guy, but this has stuck to all of us. We haven't been back there since, which is a damn shame. Before we got married, my wife and I went to a local state park, with a picnic and a hammock. We set the hammock up in the woods, enjoyed our picnic, then fell asleep together in the hammock. I was abruptly awakened by my wife. She motioned for me to be quiet. The sun had set, there was still a hint of light in the sky, but we couldn't see anything meaningful in the woods. My wife beckoned me to listen. Complete silence. Then, the snap of a branch, in the distance. More silence. We were both suddenly very on edge. We whispered to one another, trying to figure out if someone was sneaking up on us. The silence was broken again, another branch, same direction but closer. Then, from another direction, a momentary crunch of leaves. Now, we were terrified. We both had pocket knives on us, small but better than nothing. We also had a flashlight. We drew our knives and deliberated whether whatever was out there knew our location. We decided to keep the light off before giving away our exact location. Maybe we could run for the car? More steps, in rapid succession, came directly toward us, then silence again. My wife had enough. "We know you fuckers are out there," she yelled. Silence for an eternity, and then another crunch of leaves. We had enough. We prepared ourselves as best we could for a fight, then shined the flashlight into the darkness, toward the last noise we had heard. 3 deer scampered away into the darkness. We sheepishly gathered our things and left without incident. This wasn't on a hike, and this is pretty tame compared to some of these stories, but it's a bit similar. Back in our old place, one night, my girlfriend and I were walking our dogs around the neighborhood. She's a lot smaller, so I was walking 2 of the dogs, and she was walking one, who was a former service dog. He was a gentle dog, albeit a bit older. Other than snatching the ball away from the others during fetch, he'd never shown a bit of aggression. I walk a bit ahead of my girlfriend because the 2 dogs pull pretty hard on me, but not too far, maybe 10 or 15 feet ahead, but around a corner. As I found out later, she'd slowed down in part because she'd noticed someone nearby acting strangely, scoping out a house. I think, when he spotted her, he said hi, and she responded in kind, asked how he was. Before he could answer, the dog she was walking started to growl, and she apologized, commenting that he was a guard dog. The guy looked at her and said, "Well, he's doing a good job tonight." She was pretty spooked and hurried to catch up to me. We were more careful on nighttime walks from then on. I drove to a park to go hiking at night in the mountains. I hadn't even turned off my car, and I already felt like I was being watched. There weren't any cars around, so I thought maybe it was just me being paranoid for some reason. But for some reason, I looked to my right, and I saw this weird-looking humanoid shape on top of the little bump hill about 50 feet away. At first, I thought it was a weirdly shaped tree until I saw the arms move, no wind at all. So, now I know there's a person staring at my car trying not to move, for what I assume is for me to get out of my car and leave to a more secluded area as we were next to the road. Of course, I left. I don't go hiking at night in that particular park anymore. It was around midnight in a clearing for picnics in a large park that lots of people hike through, pitch black, no one around. I was with my boyfriend at the time. We got pretty frisky at one of the picnic tables, and I'm facing a river which is sort of illuminated from the moonlight. He's facing the solid black tree line. We're trying to have a good time, and he becomes completely still and in a low voice says, "A man is coming towards us." I turn my head, see only a white t-shirt approaching us at a brisk walking pace from the trees, and that's all I needed to see. I ran, knowing my boyfriend would catch up. He did. I was never down for midnight forest stuff again. Ha! When I was younger and stupider and going to college in the North Georgia mountains, my friends and I would go night hiking a lot on the trails near campus. I got pretty familiar with the area, and being out in the wilderness at night in general, which probably made me too confident. One night the full moon was out, and the weather was perfect, so visibility was crazy good. Everything was basically washed in dim blue light. I was slightly stoned, and feeling adventurous, and I love doing fun stuff alone, so I decided to go enjoy a night hike by myself. I took a flashlight, but this was around 2002, so no cell phone. I chose a super easy trail that was mostly flat or maybe a mile loop, in a pretty secluded area, but not exactly a national park or anything, very rural area. I didn't even need my flashlight for most of it, and just hiked in the moonlight. It was actually a really cool, beautiful experience at first. I started feeling uneasy at some point, and maybe a millisecond later, I heard a man's voice. It was coming from a good distance ahead of me, somewhere off in the woods, maybe from the right side of the trail. He was crying. I'm honestly an empathetic person, and 99.9% of the time I hear someone crying, I want to comfort or help them somehow, but this time I felt sick in the stomach, like a dry panic attack, if that makes sense. I remember coming very close to calling out to him, because my brain was trying to tell me he might be hurt, which was the only reason I hesitated, but it was like my body shut my voice down before I could say anything, and I knew I had to stay very quiet. He was sobbing, like he'd just found out a loved one had died, but also gibbering and almost babbling, like he was less than a person. There was a shrillness to it, under his crying, like he was holding back a scream, but perpetually, on and on, as if he'd been doing it all night. I remember it vividly, and my spine is tingling like crazy even as I write this. It's hard to explain, but I knew deep down he wasn't right in the head, and nothing good would happen if he realized I was listening. I went back the way I came. It was like I had tunnel hearing, and the only sound in the world was that crying. I was hyper aware of everything else around me and beyond paranoid that I would snap a branch or snag my boot on something. I worried the man's crying would get louder if I wasn't paying razor sharp attention, getting closer, or turning into an outraged crazy person scream. Thankfully it just faded the further I got from it, and I made it back to my car. Still, I was convinced some wild-eyed hermit was going to rush out of the forest and bite me to death, right up to the second I locked my doors and got the fuck out of there. I finally had the rest of my panic attack on the drive back. I managed to park back at campus, and I just sat in the car and collected myself. Adrenaline is fucking powerful. I have never felt a shred of guilt about leaving that guy crying out in the woods in the dark. I know I was slightly stoned, but slightly is the keyword there. I'm convinced to this day I was in very real danger that night. Definitely not as insane as most of the stories and threads like this, but sometimes I get that same sick feeling deep down, whenever I wonder what might have happened if the moon been less bright, or if I'd been more responsible, and I decided to use my flashlight even once. He'd have seen me for sure. I was out in my driveway at night with the lights off, and the dog was with me. Our neighborhood was pretty secluded, and it was a dead end. Some guy came down the hill on a bike, saw me, and stopped at the end of the driveway. He started some small talk, and the dog just sat in between me and him with his ears up, no tail wagging, etc. just stared at the guy. The guys asked if the dog bites, and I told him yes. He left. The dog actually will bite on command as he's gone through months of protection training with a professional trainer. Another time, about the same time at night, the dog started growling. I could see my neighbors' houses about a block away, and a guy was checking their car doors and then checked the front door of one of the houses. He went around the back of the house, presumably to check the back door while I was on the phone with the cops. I ran inside and grabbed a handgun, and sat on the steps on the side of my garage with the dog. The guy came back around the front of my neighbor's house and walked towards me. He got to the end of the driveway and turned around, and walked back up in the woods. The dog was just waiting for me to let go of his collar to go after the guy. Cops came and couldn't find the guy. I asked him, "What if the guy is still in the woods?" He said, "What are you worried about? You got that dog and a gun." I didn't notice, but my shirt had gotten pulled up a little, and he could see the gun on my waist. I have a carry permit, but wouldn't have needed it anyway since I was on my own property. If I sell something on Craigslist, that dog is always with me if someone comes over. I've had shady-looking people refuse to get out of the car unless I brought the dog inside. Nope, that dog is staying right with me, especially if you don't like the fact that he's there.